YouTube, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. Today, guys, we're gonna do a tier list. Now, I did this like a couple of times and there's something wrong with the recording. I don't know what. Hopefully, this would be the last one. We did this 2 streams already. My gosh. So yeah, it got corrupted. I don't know why or how it happened. Nevertheless, we're still gonna do the tier list and we're gonna fast pace this one because it has been a long time since we did this one. Could have done this last month, but I forgot. I got busy. Yeah, it's December, guys. It's Christmas. Anyways, we're gonna do last month and today's. So, there's not much that actually came in for this month, though. Only like Drytron supports and then the new Ashen Archetype, which we'll talk about it in a bit. So, without further ado, our tier list is composed of top decks, good decks, rogue, takes a good pilot, experimental decks, and decks that are, you don't want to play in the current format. So, without further ado, let's start off this shindig. First off, we have Branded. Branded is typically a good deck. End board is not too great, not too grand, but it's not too bad. You always have a play for the Branded archetype. The go-to numbers for the deck is a 60-card pile, which eventually works in your favor most of the time. Especially now, I think that we got the Light and Darkness Dragon as one of its arsenal, or one of the monsters in its arsenal, so the extra deck is going to be too tight. Nevertheless, it is still one of the best strategies to work with in the current format. Next, we have Drytrons. Drytrons is still a pretty good deck, though pretty strong. The new supports of the new Ritual Monster plus the new consistency card for the main deck made it a little bit better. I would say it's still pretty much a good deck to play, but depends on the situation, I would say. You know what? I'm going to play this as Rogue. Honestly, there are some situations where you're gonna have a hard time playing with this, and in the format that we're in, it's hard to play out with just 1 or 2 monsters on the board. You might say yes, you have a negate, but you also have in this format board breakers, so we can just put this one as a rogue deck generally. Centurions, I would say pretty good, especially if you pair it with another variant, is like Runix or White Forest. Still a crazy deck to play in the current format. Dragon Links takes a good pilot. It is one of the best decks that you can play, or good decks that you can play in the format. We got the 3 copies of Launcher now, which is pretty good, and the Collapse Serpent on 3 copies, which is pretty insane. So it made it a little bit more consistent, but takes a good pilot to play the deck. Endymions are pretty rogue. It's an okay deck to play, to be honest. Working with spell counters isn't half bad. Of course, your monsters has or uses the spell counters to negate monster effects, spell and trap cards, which is pretty formidable. But I think that's basically it. You have to set up this type of scenarios if you're going second. So spell counters isn't the most reliable thing as a pendulum deck, but it is one of the go-to decks as well if you want to play out the game into Masters. Still pretty rogue. Ashen Archetype. Don't play. Honestly, the only useful card in the Ashen Archetype at the moment is the Vidos. The Vidos monster or the boss monster on hand is one of the best quick effect monsters that you can use just to pop the field spell. Field spells like Nightmare Throne, Stand Up Centurion, Fire King Island, or even the Sanguine Summoning is one of its best choice to pop on the field, and then you can just summon the Vidos on the field. If your opponent removes the Vidos on their side, you can just board wipe your opponent, which is a pretty good card to have. Overall, the archetype is very sucky, so don't play it. Dark World, typically rogue, or maybe lesser than rogue. It is still very good though if you're gonna play it as a fun deck. I do admit that having the Silva back into the game was pretty good, but it dies sometimes to Nibiru or even a copy of Duel and Lockbird, so you might have a problem with that again if you're playing Dark Worlds. Chimera is one of the strongest strategies nowadays that you can play. I tried grinding this to Masters last month. It was an easy, like 1 to 2 hours of grind. Dynamorphia is one of your go-to strategies to work with in the current format, having a face-up or a skill drain on legs, which is the Rex term. But it is struggling if your opponent is using board breakers like Jordan Lockbird or Lightning Storm. Those kind of stuff isn't really good against a Dynamorphia deck. Nevertheless, it is still a pretty good deck to work with if you're playing it for fun. I'm gonna put it as a rogue deck. Goblin Bikers, I do think that this has potential, but at the moment, it's not a good deck to play in the current format. This might be pretty good once the new or the 2 supports lacking in the archetype comes out. But as of now, it's still not pretty good. Fire Kings, I do see Fire Kings and Snake Eyes as one of the top decks. Really good still at the moment. Not everyone is playing this at the moment because of Yubel. Gold Pride, don't play. Of course, this deck is still very bad. Ice Barriers, one of the good decks, and there's some monsters that you can retrieve from the deck into the field. If ever your opponent tries to use a monster or a card effect, you need to discard one card, which is very annoying sometimes if you're going up against Ice Barriers. Horus, I would say Horus, Kashtira's, and then your typical stun decks are one of the best choice in the current format that we are in. Just because these cards work with just a couple of spell summons, and then just support your monster or your beatdown monster on the field with just back row cards. This alone is pretty good still because majority of the time people are running Tenpais, so going first decks will shine in this type of format, still like last month. So Horus, Kashtira, Stun, Horus Stun, Kashtira Stun, and then your traditional stun decks are one of the best decks that you can, or one of the good decks that you can play in this format. Floowandereeze got the third copy of Endpen. I don't think there's some relevance to it. People are just running 2 copies of this, and it doesn't really matter though. It doesn't change anything. Although you don't want to run 3 copies of Endpen though, it is pretty bricky. But it would change, of course, if you are gonna increase the number of the map to something else. So that would be pretty good though. I think that would place that deck or this deck into Rogue if ever that would be the case. For now, it's a don't play deck. Heroes takes a good pilot, everyone knows that. Exo Sisters, pretty rogue though. I do think that their strategy of controlling the field is still okay. It's still viable. The bad part about this is the shifter to 1 copy, but some versions that I've seen so far, they're playing banishing cards like Dimensional Fissure, Macrocosmos, things like that. Although it doesn't really affect Exo Sisters that much, but it's still a pretty strong strat with Exo Sisters. Nevertheless, they're still pretty rogue. Gimmick Puppet, another good deck as well to play in the current format. FTKs are very useful with this deck. The field spell open, you are uninterrupted by any monster effects or unaffected by any monster effects. Labyrinth, pretty good still. One of the top decks, I would say. One of the go-to decks that you can actually work with against the current format that we're in. Fire Kings, Yubel, any type of deck that relies mostly with Ritual, Fusion, Exe, or Synchros, especially against Tenpai, you can actually deal with that type of deck with Labyrinth. Madolche takes a good pilot. Gary told me or sent me a video last time with regards to how Madolche works. I don't really get it that much. The strategy works too well with the Vernasilt and then with the Barrier Statue of the Drought, which is another form of win condition on the field. Vanadium, pretty rogue. You're just 1 Nibiru away from closing the game. Infernoids, I do admit that 60 card piles is the best way to play this deck, but relying solely with sending cards to the graveyard would be a good choice, I would say. Reasoning, Grass, and even Monster Gate are one of your best cards here, but there are some scenarios where you break into high-leveled monsters which you can't even summon to the field unless you have some Infernoid monsters in the graveyard. Is somewhat of a problem for the deck. Also, it's basically RNG what you send to the graveyard that would make this deck a little bit better. Nevertheless, it is one of the fun decks to play in the current format. Infernoble, and Mikankos, another good deck that you can play, but takes a good pilot. I always pair them together because they are one of the best strategies there is for the 2 archetypes. Mathmex, the same. I really thought that this is an easy deck to play, but it's not really. You need a hefty amount of experience to play this deck, and that's basically it. Melodious, I do think that the best way to play Melodious is as an engine, and for that matter, you can just play it with or add that engine to any type of deck and it will shine out. Pendulum Magicians, I think this is one of the good decks as well to play going first. Draco Slayer cards that you can access Secret Village, that being you again up against the current format that we're in, against Pyros or non-spellcaster cards alike on the field. They can't use their spell cards, which is their primary source of gaining advantage. So pendulums are still pretty good though. Ritual Beast, pretty good, takes a good pilot. I can't seem to wrap myself around the whole situation on what to summon to the field because you can only spell summon a one ritual beast monster once per turn. Nevertheless, takes a good pilot. SQA is pretty good also, especially if you pair it with Snake Eyes. Resonators, Rogue deck. If you're gonna run with synchro monsters and 1 to 3 interruptions on the board, I think it's better if you're gonna play it with Sword Soul. You're still gonna have like a couple monsters on the field, which does the same thing, and you don't exhaust all of your resources. Arcus, Rogue, definitely. Although we did get the new Nightmare cards last month, which is pretty good though, but still works the same way. Purely is pretty much Rogue. I do think that there is some situation that this would actually pan out in your favor, but as of now, I can't seem to figure it out. Nevertheless, that is Purely's. Naturias, I would say don't play. Unless you're playing this with another variant, then good. Rikas takes a good pilot. The only problem with this deck is extra deck size and the amount of time summoning the monsters to the field. Typically, you need to have experience to play this deck. And even with the new Ragnarok cards, it gained more monsters from the X deck. Another problem is, if you made a misplay, you'll get punished for it. Punks, don't play. It's just one Imperm, Ash, or Veiler, and it dies instantly. Super Heavy, hold on, I think going for Experimental. You're going to play it as an engine. I do think that using spell and trap cards are one of its core components in Yu-Gi-Oh! And if you're not even using that one, then you're going to have a hard time playing in the current format. Nevertheless, I do think that using this as an engine is more beneficial than using it as a pure. Sky Strikers, pretty rogue. There's not much I can say about Sky Strikers though. Go second builds for Sky Strikers are a little bit better. Salads, I would go for rogue. A little bit better though. Like Resonators, ceiling is too high. And you typically have like 2 or 3 interruptions on board, give or take. In the Battle of Attrition, this deck is pretty good. Runics, don't play unless you're going to play it with another variant, same as Naturias. I do think that the current version that we have, or the newest version that we have now, is with the White Forest, which is pretty nice. Scareclaws, one of the good decks as well. I really was belittling Scareclaws before, but thanks to one of the subscribers that really likes Scareclaws, yeah, I admit it is a pretty nice deck to play. Golden Sarcophagus deck, don't play. The deck has only 2 searchers, which you can just Imperm or Ash or Veiler, and then it dies instantly. And the boss monster is the only one that can search out your other cards. If you stop that, then you basically win the game at that point. Sprites, typically rogue, unless we get additional copies of Jet or Blue, it might be pretty good, or one of the Nimble cards, which I don't see that ever happening in the near future. But nevertheless, they're pretty rogue now. Gear Elements, one of the best decks, or one of the good decks that you can play in the current format. One subscriber told me that this isn't really good, but I do want to counter that notion, because on a 40 card or a 60 card pile, this deck pops off. True Draco's pretty rogue. The new Masterpiece and the 3 copies of the Field Spell made this deck a little bit better. Although control type or stun variants for the deck is a little annoying if you're going up against it, I think the only problem with this is that you get board wipe and that's the end of your game. Sword Soul, they're pretty rogue. Even though you have like 1 or 2 to 3 interruptions on the board, it's still pretty strong though. I mean, having a face-up Protoss on the field that can't be removed is pretty annoying. Tenpai is one of the best decks, hands down. Although we got Shundra to 1 copy and the Sangan summoning to 1 copy, it's still one of the powerful decks nowadays. Plus, it's one of the decks that can run 9 maxis. So, yeah. Unchained and Duel, I'm going to put them together because that is the strongest variant for the 2. And they are one of the best decks that you can play in the current format. Vanquish Soul, pretty rogue though. Vanquish Soul is a bit of a control strategy, somewhat leaning towards takes a good pilot. And you need to have the proper ratios for the deck with regards to Fire, Earth, and Dark. Trap Tricks, I would say don't play. I think it's way better if you're gonna play the stun variants for the deck rather than, or the stun variants for the good decks nowadays rather than Trap Tricks. Then we have Tri Brigade, don't play. Thunder Dragons, rogue, although the Colossus on the field is pretty neat, but it's just 1 board breaker away, like a droplet, and then you're ending your game right there. Also, the board isn't that formidable though. You just have to remove the Colossus or the Titan, and that's it. White Forest, pretty good deck, especially if you're paired with another variant or another archetype. Especially with the Centurions, it pops off, really pops off. I love this deck, so love this deck. Then lastly, we have Voices Voice as one of the best decks nowadays. Although the board isn't that great though, but the protection, the negation is really strong. Also, is another variant as well that you can pair with Kashtira's that gets you more wins. And with that, that closes. Hopefully, this is the last recording that I made for the video or for the tier list. God damn, that is quite a long video. Anyways, tell me your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll see you in the next video. Keep safe, good luck. If you like this kind of content, like and subscribe. See you guys later. Goodbye.